They watched us for 11 years before they decided we were worth killing. That was the first mistake. The second was thinking that watching us meant they understood us. Sergeant Dara Voss learned about the choir. That was what the xenobiologists eventually called them, the choir. The same way most people learned about anything that would change their lives forever. On a Tuesday, from a stranger, in a parking structure that smelled like mildew and brake dust. The stranger was a man named Okoro, who worked for SETI's Deep Field Relay Station in the Atacama, and he had driven 14 hours to find her, because he didn't trust anything with a signal attached to it anymore. He sat in the passenger seat of her car, with a hard drive on his lap and a face like a man who had recently stopped sleeping. He said, "They've been transmitting to us for over a decade, not to our governments, not to our militaries, to our cameras." She had stared at him. "Every optical sensor on Earth," he said. "Every surveillance feed, every telescope array, every phone camera and doorbell lens and satellite imager. They've been sending a signal embedded in the background radiation, at a frequency that only resolves when it hits a photonic receptor. They've been watching what our cameras see." He paused. "And now they've stopped." "When?" 4 days ago. "And 6 hours after the signal stopped, we detected 17 objects crossing the heliopause." Dara had been a combat controller for 8 years, had done 3 rotations in environments where the atmosphere itself was trying to kill her, had once held a compress on a man's femoral artery for 4 hours while extraction was delayed by weather. She did not rattle easily, but sitting in that mildewed parking structure with Okoro and his hard drive, she felt something cold settle into the base of her skull that would not leave for a very long time. "Show me," she said. He plugged the drive into her laptop. The file was 17 minutes long, and she watched all of it twice. When it was done, she sat very still with her hands in her lap. The choir's ships moved like nothing built. They did not thrust or correct or burn. They simply relocated, as if space were a suggestion rather than a medium. And they were now already inside the orbit of Neptune, and they were slowing, and they were coming here. And there were 17 of them. And each one was roughly the size of Portugal. She drove Okoro to a motel, paid cash, told him not to use his phone, and spent the drive back running numbers in her head that she already knew were meaningless. 17 ships, each the size of Portugal. Whatever was inside them had spent 11 years watching every image humanity had ever captured on a sensor. They had watched surveillance footage of parking lots and crime scenes. They had watched family videos and wildlife documentaries. They had watched surgery and war and children learning to walk. They had watched people sleep, and then they had decided to come. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought about what you would think watching all of that. What you would conclude. What decision you would make at the end of 11 years of watching and filing and cataloging about whether the thing you were watching deserved to continue. About what patterns you would identify. About what you would decide was signal and what was noise. She thought about what they might have missed. There were things that cameras captured that were not meant to be captured. A security feed in a hospital hallway catching nurse, standing alone between shifts, pressing her forehead against the wall for exactly 6 seconds, then walking back. A body cam on a police officer in a city at 3 in the morning, watching him stop in front of a poster for a missing child. Look at it for a long time. Do nothing. Keep walking. A traffic camera watching a man sit on a curb after a car accident. Not his car. Everyone else fine. Sit there for 20 minutes, just breathing, just letting himself come back from the edge. What did you do with those? What column did they go in? What did they tell you about the species you were cataloging? She thought, everything. She thought, nothing an algorithm would catch. She pulled out her notebook and started writing things down, the way she always worked through problems that were too large for her head alone. She wrote, "They have been observing us through our own tools." She wrote, "Our cameras capture what we aim them at, but also everything else." She wrote, 11 years of ambient humanity. Then she sat and looked at what she'd written and thought about the difference between data and understanding, and whether a species that had crossed the void could tell the difference between a person and a pattern. She thought maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the right question was, had they even tried? The public announcement came 6 days later, and the world reacted in the way humans always react to catastrophic news, with about 72 hours of raw, unmanageable terror, followed by an immediate and almost compulsive pivot toward ordinary life. People still went to work, still argued about sports, still took photographs of their food. There was something almost defiant about it, Dara thought, though she suspected most people were not doing it on purpose. The television was on in the break room at Peterson the morning the announcement went out, and she stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee that was already cold and watched a woman in a city somewhere, Mumbai, maybe. She couldn't see the Chiron, standing at a vegetable stall in a market, haggling over the price of tomatoes. Behind her, on a screen to a wall across the street, the UN Secretary General was making the announcement that had already been quietly distributed to every government on Earth. The announcement that said, "They are coming, and we do not know if they are coming to talk." And the woman at the vegetable stall was still haggling. Either she hadn't seen the screen yet, or she had decided that the price of tomatoes was the price of tomatoes regardless of what was happening overhead. Dara thought she understood that impulse completely. She was already at Peterson by then, attached to a joint task force with a name that had 3 acronyms in it, and met in a conference room that had been retrofitted with so much signal blocking material the walls were furry with it. The people in the room were serious. They spoke in flat, careful voices and drew diagrams and discussed response scenarios with the same professional detachment they might bring to any other threat. Assessment, which was how serious people manage things that were too large to process emotionally. Dara appreciated it. She had always found that professionalism was a kind of mercy. The lead xenocontact analyst was a woman named Dr. Priya Subramaniam, who had been at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory for 12 years and had a publication record that filled 4 pages and a habit of writing equations in the margins of her notes that had nothing to do with the meeting she was in. She was the sharpest person Dara had ever been in a room with. On day 2, she pulled up a decoded fragment of the choir's embedded signal, the part that wasn't simply passive observation, and translated it for the room in a voice that was very carefully not shaking. The closest interpretation, Priya said, is a census, a tally. They were counting things, not individuals, categories. They appear to have been classifying behaviors. She pointed to the schematic. This cluster of symbols repeats 3 billion times across the 11-year transmission. We believe it's a notation that means something like, or, not yet categorized. She paused. There are only 2 other recurring symbols in significant volume. One appears roughly 800 million times. The current working translation is something like, known pattern, comprehensible. Another pause. The 3rd symbol appears approximately 12 million times. We're not certain of the translation. The best candidates are anomaly, or error, or, she looked at the room, 3, silence. Which category did they ultimately assign us? Someone asked. Priya looked down at her notes for a long time. That's what we don't know, she said. The signal stopped before the final notation was transmitted, or Dara thought. The final notation was the ship's. She spent the next 3 days going through the decoded fragments herself, with a translation assist from the linguistics team, working backwards from the classification scheme the choir had apparently used. They were extraordinarily systematic. Every behavior that appeared in the surveillance footage had been tagged, counted, cross-referenced. Eating, tagged and categorized, consistent with known metabolic imperatives, flagged as known pattern. Sleep, tagged, categorized, flagged known pattern. Violence, tagged extensively, every instance cross-referenced with apparent triggers and outcomes, flagged known pattern. The anomaly flags were clustered around a specific and consistent type of behavior that the choir appeared to have no framework for. They were flagged as anomaly Every time a human did something that had no apparent survival, or reproductive or territorial utility. Every time a human made something, art, music, an arrangement of objects that served no functional purpose, the anomaly flag appeared. Every time a human maintained contact with another human across enormous distances with no apparent strategic benefit, the flag appeared. Every time a human did something in private with no audience, sang to themselves, danced alone in a kitchen, spent hours arranging photographs on a wall in a sequence that had meaning only to them, the flag appeared. And flagged as threat, specifically threat, not just anomaly, was something more specific. Priya's team was working on the full translation, but the preliminary finding was the threat classification appeared every time a human demonstrated the capacity for something the choir apparently had no equivalent for. Not violence, not intelligence, not technology. The capacity to act without any expected outcome. To do a thing knowing it would fail or cost or not be seen, and do it anyway. The soldier writing the careful letter in the desert. The woman singing to the ocean. The man in the hospital corridor waiting with no visible reason to wait. The choir had been watching humans for 11 years. And the thing that frightened them most was not our weapons or our numbers or our adaptability. It was the things we did for no reason at all. The choir made contact on a Wednesday morning in March, which was so mundane it felt almost like a joke. They did not broadcast to world governments or military commands. They did not use radio. They transmitted through every active camera on Earth simultaneously. The same channel they'd been using for 11 years, now reversed. And what came through was not words. It was not even images in any conventional sense. It was a recording. 11 years of what they had collected. Compressed, reorganized, played back at them. Surveillance footage and wedding videos and hospital cameras and war footage and billions of phone photos woven into a single tapestry that played for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The working interpretation, and it took 3 weeks of analysis to arrive at, was something like a charge sheet. This is what you are. This is what we have concluded you are. Look at what we have seen. What followed the recording was a single repeating symbol. The same one, over and over for 72 hours. Anomaly, error, threat. Then the 17 ships began to move. Dara was in the command bunker in Colorado when they got the first reports. She was standing at a table with 4 generals and a map of the world that was updating in real time, watching the 17 gravitational contacts begin their descent from the orbital staging positions they'd taken up over the past week. They were not targeting anything specific yet. They were positioning. That was its own kind of dread. The measured, methodical quality of it. The absence of rage or haste. Something that had a plan. Executing it. She had been trying to figure out what to do about the 3 cameras on the wall of the command center that were still active. The signal-blocking retrofit had done a lot, but the internal security system ran on its own isolated circuit, and someone had missed it. The cameras were still on. If the choir's monitoring frequency was reaching them, and there was no reason to believe it wasn't. Everything that happened in this room was being observed. She found that she didn't mind in a strange way. She thought, watch then. Watch us figure out how to fight you. See if you learn anything from that. The bunker they moved Dara's team to was 400 meters beneath a mountain in Colorado, which meant nothing against ships the size of Portugal. But the mountain made people feel better, and that was worth something. The team had grown. There were now 83 people in a space designed for 40. And the air recyclers could not quite keep up, and the place smelled of coffee and sweat and the particular sour note of people who were frightened and pretending not to be. Priya worked at a terminal in the corner and never seemed to sleep. She had taped a photograph to the edge of her monitor. Her daughter, maybe 4 years old, mid-law, caught in that specific instant of childhood, where joy is total and uncomplicated. Dara had noticed that Priya never looked at the photograph. She had taped it there, and then positioned herself, so she could not see it without deliberately turning her head. Dara understood that. Some things you kept near you not to look at, but to know they were there. She found herself thinking about the recording the choir had sent. 11 years of human life, refracted through lenses. She kept coming back to what they must have found incomprehensible. Not the violence. Violence was universal, she suspected. Any species that survived long enough to cross interstellar distances had been violent. Not the fear, not the ambition. She kept coming back to the small things. A man on a hospital security camera, sitting with a sleeping woman for 6 hours and not moving. Kids in a school hallway, 4 a.m, decoration night, completely unsupervised, laughing so hard, 2 of them were on the floor. A soldier in a forward operating base in a desert, on his 5th deployment, writing a letter with such slow, careful handwriting, it looked like calligraphy. A woman on a pier, at 3 a.m, singing into the water, alone, not for anyone, just because something in her needed to make sound. What would you conclude watching that? What category would you file it under? She thought. Maybe the problem wasn't that they classified us as a threat. Maybe the problem was that they tried to classify us at all. She ran into a young corporal named Weiss on the 3rd day in the bunker, in the narrow corridor outside the mess, both of them going to the same coffee station. He had been part of the comms team at Schriever before the consolidation. He was 24 and had the quality of young soldiers who had grown up expecting to be tested, and were now finding the test was larger than they had imagined, and were navigating the gap between those two things. He poured his coffee without saying anything for a moment, then said, "Do you think it matters, what we do here?" It was a question that did not deserve a flat professional answer, so she didn't give one. "I think it matters that we do it," she said. "Whether it changes the outcome, I don't know. But the doing of it matters. That's one of the things they can't model." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" She thought about how to explain it. "They watched us for 11 years, she said. "They have 11 years of data. They think they know how we'll respond to overwhelming force. Every species responds to overwhelming force the same way: submission or futile resistance, and then submission. It's a pattern. It's predictable." She poured her own coffee. "We're going to do something they can't predict because it's not driven by calculation. It's driven by the specific human inability to stop being human even when the math says you should." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that a plan?" "It's the only one I've got." He almost smiled. It was a near thing, and it was the most honest reaction she'd seen from anyone in 3 days. The first strike hit the Pacific, something that was not quite energy and not quite matter, delivered from a ship that had achieved low orbit, without anyone being able to track its approach. The Pacific basin subsided by 11 meters in the space of 40 seconds. The tsunami generation was secondary, almost incidental. The primary effect was geological, a shock through the crust that rang every seismograph on Earth like a bell. The second strike hit the Himalayas. The third hit the mid-Atlantic ridge. They were not targeting human settlements. That was the terrifying part. They were targeting geology, fault lines, tectonic boundaries, the articulated skeleton of the planet itself. Priya's analysis team needed less than 4 hours to reach the conclusion. The choir were not trying to kill humans. They were trying to kill Earth, render it uninhabitable, remove the substrate. "They watched us for 11 years, a general said, his voice very flat, and their conclusion was that the problem was the planet." "Not the planet," Priya said. "The conditions. They're trying to dissolve the conditions that produced us." She looked at the seismic data. "They're not angry. That's the thing that's hardest to explain to people. They're not angry, and they're not afraid of us. We're an error in a system. You don't hate an error, you correct it." Dara thought about the photograph on Priya's monitor. "What are we actually dealing with?" she said. "In terms of their sensory capabilities? What can they perceive?" Priya looked at her. "We know they use photonic reception as a primary channel. That's the camera thing. We know from spectral analysis of their ship's surface materials that they have almost no thermal detection. They're essentially thermally blind, electromagnetic, active M in a very narrow band. Nothing like radar, nothing like our sonar." Priya paused. They navigated here using something we don't fully understand yet, possibly gravitational. They find things by their mass and their light output. Dara sat with that for a moment. So, she said slowly, if you turned off every camera and every light source on Earth, you'd be asking 8 billion people to sit in the dark. I know. The room was quiet. Outside the mountain, the planet was ringing. She pitched it that night to the general and 4 admirals, and 2 people who did not give their names or affiliations, and she pitched it the way she had always pitched difficult things, with the specifics laid out, the assumptions flagged, the failure modes listed, no emotional pressure anywhere in the voice. She said, they find us through our light, not our heat, not our EM, our light. They watch our cameras because cameras collect light. They are coming to erase us because they have 11 years of our light output, telling them exactly what and where we are, she said. If we go dark, they have to reacquire. She said, reacquisition takes time, and time right now is the only resource we have. One of the unnamed people said, you want to turn off every electrical light source on the surface of the planet, and underground, and every satellite, and every airborne asset, everything that emits in the visible or near-visible spectrum. The global economy would. There is no global economy in 6 weeks if we don't do this. Silence. The logistic. I know. The general looked at her for a long time. He was 60 years old and had the face of a man who had made decisions that he lived with the way you live, with chronic pain, not always in the foreground, but never truly absent. He said, how long would we need to stay dark? Long enough to reposition. Long enough to use what we've been working on. She pulled up the schematics for Project Blindside on her tablet and slid it across the table. They navigate by gravity and light. We kill the light. We put the gravity signatures where we need them to be, and we stop being a fixed, visible target. The general looked at the schematics for a long time without speaking. Then he said, get Subramaniam in here. Priya arrived in the conference room at 2 a.m., still carrying the pen she'd been using. She looked at the schematics, asked 3 questions, worked something out on the back of a notepad, looked up. It's possible, she said. Probable? I said possible. The gravitational array will work. The question is whether the blackout holds globally for long enough. You can't have gaps. One city, one military installation that keeps its lights on. That's a beacon. That's where they look. She paused. You're asking the entire world to trust the plan and to hold without breaking. Without communication, essentially, since any signal they could receive is a signal the choir might detect. Courier's networks, Dara said. Shortwave on minimum power. It can be done. Can it be trusted? Globally? Every government, every military, every city that's scared and in the dark. And hearing the strikes getting closer, Dara thought about what she'd been thinking since the parking structure, about the woman haggling over tomatoes, with the announcement playing behind her, about the corporal pouring his coffee, about the photograph on Priya's monitor, placed where it didn't need to be seen to be felt. Yeah, she said. I think it can. Priya looked at her for a moment that was longer than professional. Then she nodded and picked up her pen and started writing. What followed was 48 hours that Dara would never be able to describe adequately to anyone who hadn't been inside them. Not because they were uniquely dramatic. There were no singular moments of heroism, no speeches, no clear hinge points. But because everything happened simultaneously, and on too many fronts for any one person to hold it all. The thing she remembered most clearly afterward was the smell of the bunker changing. At some point in the second day, the fear smell faded. It didn't become something hopeful. It became something more focused. People stopped talking about their families and started talking about frequencies. The global blackout was coordinated through a system of low-power shortwave relays and physical couriers. The choir had compromised or could observe everything digital, and it happened in rolling waves, time zone by time zone, as if someone were slowly extinguishing a fire. From orbit, the Earth went dark in 16 hours. Not completely dark. Volcanic activity, wildfires, bioluminescence. But the ordered grids of human civilization simply ceased to emit. Cities that had blazed like second stars became invisible. She had thought it would feel like defeat. Standing in the bunker, in the dark, they had cut their own power to everything non-essential, operating on a single shielded circuit. She had thought the absence of light would feel like capitulation. It didn't. It felt like something else. It felt in a way she couldn't explain, but felt entirely like defiance. Like the specific defiance of a thing that refuses to be located. Like a soldier who disappears into terrain that kills everyone else because she knows the terrain and they don't. Like the knowledge that you exist in a space, someone is searching for you and they cannot find you, and you are right there. Priya tracked the choir's response from seismic data, from gravitational sensors, from the tiny, observable sliver of their behavior that they could actually measure. She reported it to Dara at hour 19, with a look on her face that was not quite relief and not quite terror. "They've stopped," she said. "The strikes? The strikes, the orbital repositioning, everything." She stared at the data. "They're scanning. Active scans, trying to reacquire us. But the scans are photonic. They're looking for light. And there's nothing to find." Dara let out a breath she had been holding for a long time. "How long do we have before they recalibrate to a different detection method?" "I don't know. Weeks maybe. Maybe less." Priya looked at her. "Your people need to be in position before that happens." "They will be." The thing about going dark is that it doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like surrender. It feels like hiding, and hiding feels like losing. And the hardest part was not the cold or the deprivation or the logistical nightmare of 8 billion people operating without electricity. It was the psychological weight of it. The sense that in going invisible, they were conceding something essential. People are not made to turn off their lights and wait. But they did it. That was the thing. Every city, and every town, and every farmhouse, and every ship at sea, informed through a chain of whispered communication that spread like a living thing, and they did it. There was grief in it. There was anger in it. There was a woman in Dublin who ran a food bank and kept one solar lantern burning at the back of a boarded-up room so she could keep giving out parcels in the dark, and she got away with it because one lantern is lost in the noise of a planet. There was a man in Sao Paulo who spent the first night of the blackout sitting on his roof, holding a flashlight he didn't turn on. Just holding it, the way you hold something you refuse to put down, as if holding it were itself a kind of light. There was a hospital in Mumbai that kept its surgical theater operational on shielded, directed power that emitted nothing upward, and performed 43 operations in the first week of the dark, and every one of them survived. There were children who had never known a sky without light pollution, and who, in the darkness of a city that had gone quiet and invisible, saw the Milky Way for the first time. Several of them were reported to have cried. Their parents reported having no idea what to say. There was a village in northern Norway that had been without grid power for 3 months due to a supply disruption, unrelated to any of this, and whose residents heard about the blackout protocol via courier and said, more or less collectively, "We already did this. We're fine. Here is what we learned." Dara heard about all of these things later, in fragments, through the courier reports that passed through the coordination center. At the time, she was 4 kilometers underground, with 17 other people, and a problem that did not have a good solution, only a least bad one. Project Blindside had 2 components. The first was the blackout. The second was what the blackout was buying time for. The choir navigated by gravity. Their ships were tuned to the gravitational signature of large bodies, planets, primarily, but also anything with sufficient mass concentration. 17 years earlier, before anyone had known the choir existed, a team at CERN had accidentally discovered something while trying to solve a different problem entirely. A method of inducing temporary, localized gravitational anomalies using a configuration of rotating superconducting rings. The effect was small, fractions of a percentage point of deviation, and the energy cost was enormous, and the duration was brief, and the team had filed it as a curiosity and moved on. Nobody had thought it was useful. Nobody had been thinking about aliens at the time. The lead engineer on Blindside was a man named Lindquist, a Swedish astrophysicist, with the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who have spent decades working on problems that have no deadline. He had been working with the arrays for 6 years. He knew their limits better than anyone. What you're describing, he had told Dara 6 months earlier, when Blindside was still theoretical, is essentially telling a ship that's navigating by gravity that the planet is somewhere it isn't. You're not moving the planet. You're changing what the planet's gravity feels like from a given angle, spoofing the signature. Can we do it at scale? Scale is relative. We have 3 operational arrays, the ones in Chile, the Atacama installation, and the one under the Tibetan plateau. If you run them in concert, he had shrugged, you can make the gravitational signature of Earth look like it's shifted by roughly 40 kilometers in any given direction. From the perspective of a ship navigating by gravity, you appear to be somewhere you aren't. For how long? Until the ring's superconducting state collapses from heat buildup. Maybe 6 minutes. 6 minutes. She had done the math. 6 minutes. Combined with the targeting solutions they'd been developing for 2 years. Combined with the one genuine military asset they had that was worth anything. The mass driver array on the lunar far side, operational for 4 years, and never publicly acknowledged, and capable of accelerating a 6-ton tungsten rod to 0, 4% of light speed. And you had something that was not quite a trap, and not quite a weapon, but was the closest thing to both that humanity currently possessed. 6 minutes of misdirection, 1 shot. The problem was you only got one. The array's superconducting rings would be destroyed by the heat of full operation. There was no second attempt. Either the targeting solutions were right and the ships moved into the kill zone, or they didn't, and then you had damaged ships that were still operational and also furious, and no remaining assets to press the engagement. She had sat with that for a while. Then she had said, "We'll take it." She was thinking about the film the choir had sent back, their census, their charge sheet. She kept returning to one sequence. She had watched the recording dozens of times by now, each time catching something new, a cluster of images the choir had apparently found significant enough to group together and repeat. Not violence, not construction, something she couldn't immediately categorize. A woman in a kitchen at 2 a.m. eating cereal directly from the box, just standing there at the counter in the dark. A man in a hospital waiting room, drawing something in a small notebook, something intricate and careful. A pattern or a map, while next to him people cried and made phone calls, and a television reported news that he appeared entirely not to hear. 2 soldiers in a forward position playing cards during a lull, completely absorbed, as if the war around them had ceased to exist for the duration of the hand. A girl of maybe 8, sitting on a fire escape in a city at night, looking up at a sky where no stars were visible. Looking at it anyway, looking at nothing, looking at the dark. The choir had flagged all of it as anomaly, error, threat, because they couldn't categorize it, not as survival behavior, not as communication, not as resource acquisition or territorial display or reproductive strategy. Just humans doing things that made no adaptive sense, for reasons the choir's 11-year survey had failed to resolve. Dara thought, maybe they were right to be afraid. Maybe the thing about humans is not that we're violent or resilient or adaptable, though we are all of those things. Maybe the thing about humans is that we contain multitudes in a way that genuinely cannot be modeled. A man writing a careful letter in a war zone. A woman singing into the ocean at 3 a.m. All of that irreducible human interiority that has nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the specific texture of being alive inside a body that knows it's going to end. You cannot predict a species like that. You cannot wargame them. You cannot look at 11 years of their footage and know what they'll do when you come for them, because they themselves do not know until they're doing it. That was the threat the choir had identified and hadn't known how to name. She had a hunch, and it was only a hunch. But she had learned to trust her hunches the way she'd learned to trust anything that appeared repeatedly in datasets without explanation, that the choir's decision to move on them wasn't about the violence in the footage, or the weapons, or the territorial behavior. Those things they had frameworks for. Those things made sense to them. What had finally tipped the census from unresolved to threat was the 12 million anomaly flags. The behaviors without purpose, the things that didn't fit any model. They had come here because they had watched humans for 11 years, and they still didn't know what humans were. And the things you cannot categorize are the things you cannot control. And the things you cannot control are the things you eliminate. The arrays came online at 0400 on a Sunday morning. Dara was in the coordination center, a hardened facility attached to the Atacama installation, stripped of everything that emitted. And the room had that specific quality of silence that falls over people who are waiting for something that cannot be untimed. 23 people. The air smelled of metal and exhaustion. Lindqvist was at the primary console, his hands very steady. Priya was at the analysis station, feeding him the choir's positional data in real time. There was a man named Chen, who had been awake for 31 hours, running final targeting calculations, and who had taped a small card to his terminal that said, in his own handwriting, "Trust the math." She had seen it when she came in and had said nothing, because it was exactly right. 3 of the 17 ships had moved to low orbit. That was the problem. The original plan had been designed for the ships at distance, outside the gravity well. 3 of them had crossed inside it during the reacquisition scan phase, and those 3 were now positioned in low orbit, and those 3 could not be addressed by the lunar driver without significant atmospheric interference from the deflection of a tungsten rod at that velocity through a substantial column of air.
"We take the 14.
Dara had said when this became clear. And the 3 in orbit? She had been quiet for a moment. "We have other options for the 3. She had not specified what the other options were, because at that point, they were not fully formed, and in her experience, it was better to be clear about what you knew, and quiet about what you didn't, rather than commit to a specific plan that would need to be revised under pressure. The other options had been forming in her mind for 4 days. She kept coming back to something Priya had said. They're essentially thermally blind. And to something Lindqvist had said, the gravitational spoof works because their navigation is passive. They're receivers, not scanners. And to something she herself had realized. At 3 in the morning on the 4th day, staring at the ceiling of her small room in the facility, listening to the facility's ventilation system and the distant sound of someone on the night shift, talking quietly on a radio. They have been watching our cameras for 11 years. They have been receiving our light. That's their primary sensory channel. What happens when you don't just turn off the lights, but you turn them back on in a specific pattern? What happens when you use their receiver against them? She had spent 3 days with 2 signal engineers working out whether it was possible, and they had told her it was possible in the same tone people used when they meant it was theoretically possible and practically insane. And she had said, "Okay, good enough." The gravitational arrays fired at 0417. From the perspective of the 14 choir ships at distance, the gravitational signature of Earth abruptly relocated, sharp, definitive, impossible to misread, to a point 40, Zeus in kilometers offset from the actual planet. Their navigation systems corrected. They moved toward the spoof signature. They moved with the absolute confidence of technology that had never been wrong about something like this before, because nothing in their experience had ever interfered with gravitational sensing at planetary scale. The lunar mass driver fired at 0419. 14 tungsten rods, each 6 tons, each moving at 0.4% of light speed, on trajectories calculated over 4 years by a team of people who had given that work everything they had. 14 rods for 14 ships. The math was brutally simple. The execution was not. 12 hit. 11 resulted in confirmed hull breaches of unknown depth. 7 resulted in what the spectral analysis would later describe as catastrophic structural failures. Two of the ships simply ceased to be detectable. Not destroyed, necessarily, but gone in a way that the sensors could not characterize, which might have been worse. Two missed. One of them missed by a margin that made Lindqvist close his eyes and press both hands flat on the console and breathe for a moment in the particular way of a person choosing not to say what they are thinking. And then it was 0421, and the gravitational spoof collapsed, and the 12 damaged ships, and the 2 undamaged ones, and the 3 in low orbit, all a full picture of where Earth actually was. And the silence in the coordination center was the silence of people who had just spent everything they had and were not sure it was enough. It was the silence of a held breath that cannot be held much longer. It was the silence of people who were very good at their jobs and had done those jobs perfectly and were now waiting to see if that was sufficient. Chen was still looking at his card. Trust the 3 orbital ships did not respond immediately. That was the first unexpected thing. They hung in low orbit. Priya was tracking them on gravitational sensors, the only detection method still functioning, and they did not move. They're waiting, Priya said. For what? I don't know. She stared at her data. They might be waiting for instruction from the others. They might be assessing, trying to understand what just happened. Dara thought about the anomaly notation, the error symbol, that had appeared 12 million times in the choir's census. She thought about what it must mean to a species that had been systematically categorizing the universe for what might be millions of years, to encounter something that kept falling outside your categories. Something that did not respond to force with submission. Something that disappeared when you looked for it. Something that had tricked your navigation by exploiting a vulnerability in a technology so fundamental to your civilization that the vulnerability had simply never been imagined. She thought, they don't know what we just did. They know we did something. They don't know what it was. And they are, for the first time in this engagement, uncertain. She said to the 2 signal engineers, "Is it ready?" They looked at each other. One of them, a young woman named Torres, who had barely slept in 5 days and had a quality of focused exhaustion that Dara recognized and respected, the kind that comes from work that matters more than the person doing it, said, as ready as it's going to be, what Torres and her partner had built in 72 hours, on no sleep and full access to the global camera network that the choir had been using as a passive receiver, was a transmitter, not a signal in any conventional sense, not a message in any language, a transmission in the choir's own channel, the photonic embedding frequency of something they had never sent and never seen, and did not have a category for. They had the recording the choir had sent, the charge sheet, the 11 years of human footage, assembled into 4 minutes and 12 seconds of evidence, and they had added to it 48 hours of footage from the blackout period, gathered from shielded internal security systems in hospitals and bunkers and shelters, hospitals performing surgery in the dark with handheld instruments, food banks operating by touch and by the sound of familiar voices, a man in a tunnel, Tokyo organizing 100 people. He had never met with nothing but a whistle and a headlamp that he turned toward the floor to minimize the emission. Children sleeping in pitch-black rooms while parents sat awake and watchful in doorways, holding nothing, doing nothing, just there. A city of 4 million people, invisible, silent, alive, existing in the complete dark with a tenacity that had nothing to do with any category in any census. "We are here," the footage said without saying it. "You tried to find us. You could not. We're still here. And one other thing." Torres had argued about this last element for 6 hours, standing at the console with her arms crossed, and a very direct expression that Dara had come to respect as the signal that she was saying something important. She had said it was not strategic. She had said it did not communicate anything comprehensible. She had said that, including it, was purely emotional and possibly compromised the integrity of the transmission by diluting the signal with noise the choir would not be able to process. Dara had said, "Put it in." The last 40 seconds of the transmission was footage from a hospital security camera in a bunker 3 below the surface of a city that was now invisible from space. Filmed 4 days earlier, a woman, a doctor, still in her scrubs, her hair still in a working knot, her hands still with the particular callus pattern of someone who had been scrubbing in multiple times a day. Sitting against a wall in a corridor, alone between shifts, holding a small folded piece of paper in both hands. Reading it again, her lips moved slightly. The expression on her face was not happiness and was not grief. It was the specific expression of a person who is very far from someone they love and is holding the proof that they exist. That somewhere, in the dark, a specific person had made this specific mark, and the mark had traveled to her, and it was real, and she was real, and they were both real, and the distance between them was painful and temporary. She read it. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She stood up and went back to work. Torres had been right that it didn't communicate anything. It communicated everything. Those were not the same problem. Dara said, "Send it." The transmission went out at 0503, embedded in the same photonic frequency the choir had used for 11 years, bounced through the global camera network, pushed out on every sensor that still had power, aimed at the 3 ships in low orbit. It played once. Then it looped. They kept it running. The 3 ships did not move for 6 hours. Priya watched her data with the focus of someone who has stopped being afraid of a specific outcome and is now simply watching. She reported the status every 20 minutes. The same careful, flat voice, no interpretation offered. It reminded Dara of a doctor reporting vitals. Not because the vitals were unremarkable, but because a calm voice was itself a form of care. At hour 7, 2 of the 3 ships changed their orbital velocity. They did not descend. They did not move toward a strike position. They increased altitude. Slowly, steadily, unmistakably. Increasing altitude, which meant increasing distance, which meant retreat, which was a word. No one in the room said aloud because saying it aloud felt like something that could jinx it. Dara noticed that Priya had stopped taking notes. Her pen was in her hand, but she was just watching the display, the numbers moving. Priya looked up from her station. 2 of the 3 are. She stopped, started again. 2 are withdrawing. The room did not cheer. People who have been awake for multiple days running on adrenaline and fear do not cheer when something good happens. They go very still instead, and breathe, and look at their hands, and make very small sounds that don't have names. Someone put their head down on a console and didn't move for a while. Chen turned his card face down. Lindqvist said something quietly in Swedish that nobody translated. The 3rd ship remained in orbit. It remained there for 4 more hours. Dara did not leave the coordination center. She sat in a chair with bad ergonomics and a cold cup of coffee and watched Priya's data and tried not to need the 3rd ship to move. She was aware that needing things was a luxury she currently couldn't afford. She was aware that the math on what remained of the damaged fleet was still very bad. She was aware that this was at best a pause and not an ending. She was aware that the doctor had folded her letter and put it in her pocket and gone back to work. At hour 11, Priya said, "It's moving." The 3rd ship's orbital velocity had changed. Not withdrawing. Not descending into a strike position. Moving into a new orbital slot. A station-keeping position, closer, but not attack geometry. And Dara felt the cold thing at the base of her skull come back and start to say. But then the ship's signal profile changed on the display, and it was not preparing to strike. "It's positioning for communication," Priya said. Her voice was strange, not fearful. Something quieter than that, something that would take her a while to name. "It's aligning on our photonic channel. The same frequency." She looked at Dara. "It wants to talk." What the choir sent took 3 days to decode, and the translation was never certain. Language is already a difficult problem. Communicating with a species whose sensory and cognitive architecture had no overlap with your own is not a problem that yields to any clean solution. What the team arrived at was a working interpretation that Priya described as approximately 40% confident which in the context of interspecies first contact was apparently the best you could do. Dara had expected something that resembled threat or demand, or the formal notation of a military communication. What they got was harder to categorize than any of that. The core of it seemed to be revision, not apology, not the human concept of remorse, something more clinical, a census notation being updated. The symbol that appeared most frequently in the transmission was one they had not seen before, which meant either that it was new in their lexicon, or that it had simply not appeared in the previous 11 years of passive transmission. The linguistics team debated this for hours. The distinction mattered. New meant the concept was new to them. Not previously transmitted meant they had had the concept all along and were applying it to humanity for the first time. The nearest interpretation they reached after 3 days was something like category unknown, pending, unresolved, not anomaly, not error, not threat, unresolved, requiring further observation. It was not peace. It was not alliance. It was not even fully survival. The damaged ships were still out there. The 2 undamaged ones had not gone anywhere, and the choir's withdrawal was not a retreat so much as a pause, a footnote in a census that was still being written. But it was something. It was a species that ran on categories and taxonomies and systematic understanding, encountering something that would not fit and doing the hardest thing any mind can do, deciding not to resolve the uncertainty by force, sitting with not knowing, choosing to observe instead of to erase. Priya stared at the translation for a long time after the team had finished. Then she turned to her monitor and looked, for the first time since she had put it there, at the photograph of her daughter, the 4-year-old mid-law, total uncomplicated joy, caught in a moment that was already months old, and would never exist again in exactly that form. She looked at it for a while. "They'll come back," she said. "Probably," Dara said. "With better sensors, better understanding, a different approach. Probably. And we'll still be what we are." Dara thought about that. Thought about the woman reading the letter in the corridor. About the man with the unlit flashlight on the roof in Sao Paulo. About the children on the fire escape, looking at a dark sky with full attention. About all of it, all 11 years of what the choir had collected and failed to categorize. All those millions of anomaly notations piled up like sediment, the residue of being human. "Yeah," she said. "We'll still be what we are." She thought that was probably enough. There is a word in Japanese. The team's linguist had mentioned it in passing during one of the long analysis sessions. Irrelevantly, the way people offer small things when there is nothing else to give. The word is mono, no aware, which roughly translates as the pathos of things. The poignant acknowledgement of impermanence, the emotion that is not quite sadness, and not quite joy, but inhabits the exact space between them. It is the feeling you have watching a thing that is beautiful and transient. Cherry blossoms. The last light on a winter afternoon. A 4-year-old laughing at something that only she can see. The linguist, a Kenyan woman named Odiambo, who had been working on the translation for 72 hours without meaningful sleep, and who had earned the right to say anything she wanted, had offered it as a possible framework for understanding something in the choir's transmission. One symbol, recurring not in the threat cluster or the anomaly cluster, but in a third cluster, the team had not been able to classify. It appeared specifically adjacent to images in the footage that showed humans in contact with things they knew would end. Goodbye at train stations. The last day of a season. Children aging in the frame of a single-family video. Odiambo said, "They may have a word for this, or a concept adjacent to it. The symbol appears in context that suggests something like, aware of finitude, or performing meaning in the face of termination," she said. "It's possible that's part of what they don't know what to do with. Not that we die, but that we know we die and we keep going anyway. Not just surviving, building things, making sounds into the air for no one, holding photographs of people we can't get to," she said. "A species that does not die, or that does not know it does, would have no category for that." Dara had sat with that for a long time in the quiet that followed it, she thought. The choir's 11-year census had been looking for threats. They had found something else. They had found a species that felt aware for its own existence, that made elaborate rituals around impermanence, that kept creating and recording and transmitting. Not because it would survive the heat death of the universe, nothing would, but because the creating and recording and transmitting was the point, was the thing itself, was what life was for, in the specific form that life had taken here, on this pale rock, in this ordinary corner of one galaxy among billions, the woman singing into the ocean at 3 a.m. Just because something in her needed to make sound. That was the anomaly. That was the error. That was, in the end, the thing that saved them. 6 months after the withdrawal, Dara stood on a hillside in Chile at dusk and watched the sky go the particular color it goes in the Atacama when the day is ending, something that is technically orange, but is in practice indescribable, a color that seems to belong to a different atmosphere than the daytime sky, something from elsewhere, borrowed from a more dramatic planet, and returned before anyone could notice it was gone. The Atacama installation hummed somewhere below her. The arrays were in standby mode, not dismissed, not decommissioned, because nobody was pretending this was over. It was paused, pending, unresolved in the best possible sense. The world had been coming back online slowly, city by city, grid by grid, over the past 6 months. It was not like flipping a switch. It was more like a body recovering from a severe shock, cautious and tender, testing each function before trusting it. Some cities had decided not to come back fully. There was a movement, not large yet, but present, of people who had lived for weeks in the dark and found something there they didn't want to lose entirely, who had discovered that a sky full of stars was worth something, who had decided that some portion of the illumination they'd been carrying was not necessary. Dara didn't know what to make of that. She thought maybe you didn't have to make anything of it. Some things were just what they were. Her phone had a voice message on it from her brother, who had called to tell her about something his kid had said that morning, something funny and specific and completely untranslatable. One of those moments that only exists at the scale of a particular child, at a particular age, irreproducible, already gone by the time you finish laughing. He had called to record it, to put it somewhere, to make it last just a little longer than it would have on its own. She listened to it twice. The kid's voice was high and serious, performing the logic of a 4-year-old with complete conviction. Her brother's laugh at the end was the kind of laugh that belongs in that specific space between a parent and a child, warm and helpless, and also, somehow, a little sad, the way joy always contains its own ending. She stood on the hillside in the Atacama and listened to it, and felt something she could not have named, and above her the sky went from orange to violet, to the particular dark blue that precedes stars, and the stars came out, and some of them were not stars. She kept watching anyway. Below her, in the installation, someone had brought a guitar into the common room. She could hear it faintly through the ventilation outlet. Something simple, not quite a song yet, the sound of someone working out a melody that wasn't finished. The notes carried up through the cool, dry air, small and clear, and going nowhere except into the dark, which was exactly where they needed to go. She thought about what the choir had seen. 11 years of humanity, compressed into a 4-minute transmission, meant as a verdict. All that light, all those cameras, all those billions of small, ordinary human moments, the letters and the card games and the singing and the looking, gathered and examined, and ultimately filed under. Unresolved, she thought. Good. The guitar found its melody. Someone in the installation began to hum along with it, and then a second voice joined, harmonizing not quite perfectly, which somehow made it better. The sound rose into the dark and went nowhere, addressed to nothing, offered to no one in particular. Just the sound of people alive in the dark, doing what people do when they're alive, and the night is quiet, and the music wants to exist. Above the Atacama, the sky was full of stars. Some of them were watching. None of them knew what to make of her. She was okay with that. She stayed on the hillside for a long time, not going in, listening to the guitar, watching the sky, feeling the cold of the altitude settle into her bones in the specific way it did up here, sharp and clean, a cold that was honest about what it was, letting herself be unresolvable, the way all the people in all the footage had been unresolvable. Not despite their humanity, but because of it, because of the irreducible, untaxonomizable, deeply illogical, and absolutely essential fact of being human, which is, you will sit on a hillside and watch stars even when you know what lives in them. You will make music at the end of the world. You will hold unlit flashlights. You will read letters in corridors. You will sing to the ocean alone at 3 a.m. because something in you needs to. Because that is the thing they cannot calculate, or correct, or file. Because it falls outside every census and every category and every 11 Irve of everything that humanity is and does and makes. Because it is not adaptive and not strategic and not explicable in any framework a sufficiently advanced civilization has developed to describe the behavior of other minds. Because you are not a threat or an anomaly or an error. You are pending, unresolved, still happening, and whatever is out there, whatever has 11 years of your footage and is still watching, still studying, still failing to arrive at a final notation, it had better learn to sit with that, because you are not going anywhere. The guitar played on. Somewhere in the installation a door opened, and someone said something funny, and there was laughter, and the laughter went up into the dark along with the music, and none of it was for anyone, and all of it was everything. The stars watched. The night was patient, and humanity, stubborn and singing, and thoroughly unclassifiable, kept existing into the dark. She had not spoken to Okoro since the parking structure. She had tried twice. Once during the initial consolidation phase, once about a month. And both times the courier route had come back undelivered, which meant either where he was deeper in the system, or something had happened to him. She tried not to think about the second option too hard. On the second day after the withdrawal, a message reached the Atacama installation via the shortwave relay network in an envelope addressed to her personally. Inside was a single index card with a latitude and longitude on it and a time, and below that, in handwriting she recognized. Still here. Thought you should know. She went to the coordinates, which were a hilltop 40 minutes drive from the installation, at the specified time, which was dawn. Okoro was there. He looked the same, or close to it. The face of a man who had not stopped sleeping so much as learned to do it differently, in intervals, in small secured pieces. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. I heard it worked, he said. We don't know what worked yet. The thing where they stopped. The thing where one of them wanted to talk. Yeah, she took the coffee. That part worked. They stood on the hilltop and drank their coffee and looked at the sky, which was doing what the Atacama sky did at dawn, which was something so completely unreasonable in its beauty that it felt almost aggressive. I've been thinking, Okoro said, about why they started watching through the cameras in the first place. 11 years ago, they could have sent a probe. They could have used any number of passive detection methods. Why piggyback on our own sensors? She had thought about this too. Because our sensors pointed where we pointed them. Because we aimed them at the things we thought were worth recording. He nodded. So what they got was not a survey of humanity. It was a survey of what humanity thought mattered enough to look at. Yeah, that's different. It's very different. What they saw wasn't us. It was what we chose to see. What we decided was worth capturing. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. All the things we photographed and filmed and recorded. Everything we thought deserved to be kept. 11 years of that. She thought about it. That explains the anomaly, flags. How a species conducting a survey would photograph its resources, its threats, its territory. It would record functionally. We recorded everything, the mundane, the pointless, the things that couldn't possibly have strategic value. She paused. We recorded people sleeping. We recorded meals. We recorded children drawing pictures. We recorded people playing music. that no one was going to hear for the second time. We recorded things we knew were going to end. Things we knew were already ending. We recorded them specifically because they were ending. Okoro was quiet for a while. They thought we were documenting threats, he said. But we were documenting love. She thought about that, or the closest word we have for it. And that's what they couldn't categorize. That's what they couldn't categorize. The sun was fully up now. The Atacama stretched out below them in all directions, vast and pale and mineral, the kind of landscape that made you feel appropriately small in a way that was more clarifying than frightening. Above it, the sky was deep blue going violet and absolutely clear. She had been told once that the Atacama was the clearest sky on Earth, that you could see things here that were invisible everywhere else, that the altitude and the dryness and the absence of light pollution stripped away every layer of interference between you and the universe. She thought, we were making ourselves visible to the universe. Every photograph, every security camera, every phone pointed at a face, every lens aimed at a sky. 11 years of saying, we are here. This is what we see. This is what we thought was worth the looking. And the universe looked back and didn't know what to do with what it found. She ran into Torres 3 weeks after the withdrawal, in the mess hall of the installation, at an unreasonable hour in the morning. Torres was eating eggs and reading something on a paper printout. Old habit or new caution or both. She looked up when Dara sat down across from her. The last 40 seconds, Dara said. Torres put down her fork. Yeah. Did you figure out why it worked? If it worked. Torres was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that. Why their receiver responded to it specifically. The hospitals and the food banks and the blackout footage. Those communicated something strategic. We exist. You didn't erase us. You failed. That's parsable. That's threat assessment data. She pushed the eggs around. The woman with the letter is different. How? Because there's no survival content in it. There's nothing about numbers or resources or territory or capability. It's just presence. It's just a person being present to another person who isn't there. Through an object. Through the marks someone made. Torres looked at her printout. I think what it communicated, if it communicated anything, was the thing they kept flagging as anomaly. The specific human thing where something isn't about survival, but you do it anyway. You maintain connection across distance for no strategic reason. You hold a piece of paper in a corridor and read it again. You think that scared them. I think that confused them in a way that made them recalculate. Torres picked her fork back up. A species that does things for no survival reason is unpredictable in a very specific way. You can model aggression. You can model resource competition. You can model fear responses. You cannot model love. You cannot model a civilization that encodes itself into pieces of paper and sends them across distances just to maintain the reality of another person. She paused. That's not a threat assessment. That's something outside the threat assessment framework entirely. Dara thought about that. We won because we're incomprehensible, she said. We're still here because we were incomprehensible, Torres said. That's not the same as winning. She was right. It was not winning. It was a temporary stay in a larger process that had not concluded. The choir would return, or others would come, and the census would continue, and humanity would keep generating anomaly flags in whatever monitoring system was pointed at it. But the anomaly flags were not a vulnerability. They were the most fundamental truth about what humans were. Thing that could not be corrected because it was not an error. The soldier writing the letter. The woman singing to the water. The girl on the fire escape looking at a dark sky. The doctor reading a piece of paper in a corridor and putting it in her pocket and going back to work. Priya published her analysis of the choir's census in a form accessible to the public 6 months after the withdrawal. It was not a scientific paper. Those would come later, dozens of them, by many authors. It was a document addressed to no one in particular, or to everyone, which was the same thing. It ran to 40 pages and began with a section about the 4.3 billion unresolved flags. She had traced them all, or as many as the processing power of the available systems could manage. She had mapped their distribution. She had looked at what they corresponded to in the original footage. She wrote, "The most frequently flagged category of human behavior across the full 11-year dataset was not violence or territorial aggression or competitive resource acquisition. It was the maintenance of interpersonal connection in the absence of any immediate strategic benefit. Humans called or wrote or traveled to be near people who were not essential to their survival, who offered no tactical advantage, whose proximity contributed nothing to their competitive position. They did this with extraordinary consistency across cultures, geographies, socioeconomic conditions, and historical periods. They did it during wars and famines and pandemics. They did it when it was expensive and inconvenient. They did it when the person they were maintaining contact with was dying and would be gone soon, and no amount of presence would change that." She wrote, "The choir flagged this behavior as anomalous because it fell outside the predictive models they had built for sapient species behavior. It was not adaptive in any framework they possessed. It was not explicable as resource optimization or kin selection or any mechanism that produces pro-social behavior in other species, whose behavior they had cataloged." She wrote, "I believe they were correct to call it anomalous. I believe it is anomalous. I believe it is the most anomalous thing about us, and the most important." She wrote, "We survived because they could not predict what we would do. We survived because we had spent 11 years showing them, on camera, everything we were, including and especially the parts that don't make sense, including and especially the things we do for no reason, except that we cannot stop being human, which is a thing that cannot be corrected because it is not broken." She wrote, at the very end, "To whatever is still watching, and I believe something is always watching. Hello, we are still here, we are pending, we are unresolved, we are still making things, and recording things, and sending pieces of ourselves across distances to people we love. You can categorize that however you like. It will still be true when you come back." Dara read the document at the Atacama installation, alone in her small room, on a quiet evening when the ventilation system was doing its faint hum, and the whole facility had the quality of a thing, resting between efforts. She read it twice. Then she sat for a while and thought about the woman with the letter. The doctor, still in her scrubs, alone in the corridor, holding the proof that someone existed. She got out her own notebook, the paper one, old habit, the kind that couldn't be monitored, and wrote something in it. Not tactical notes, not analysis. Just, "I was here. This is what I saw." Then she put it back in her bag and went to bed. She slept well. She dreamed of the Atacama sky, orange and indescribable, belonging to a different atmosphere, borrowed from elsewhere. In the dream she was standing on the hillside, and the sky was full of light that was not stars, and she was looking at it, and something was looking at her, and neither of them looked away. She woke up with the feeling that she had communicated something. She thought that might be the point. The coordination center was never fully decommissioned. It was repurposed, expanded, staffed differently, given a new name and a new mandate that was formally about long-term monitoring, but was really about something harder to name, maintaining the state of being in relationship with whatever was out there. Watching the watchers, keeping the line open, making sure that when the choir came back, or whoever came next, whatever other census was being conducted by, whatever other intelligence was, pointing its sensors at the third rock from an ordinary star, they would find a species still doing what it had been doing, still singing to the ocean, still writing letters, still recording the things it thought were worth keeping. Dara was at the coordination center 2 years after the withdrawal, during a routine review cycle, when Priya called her into the analysis room with a look on her face that was carefully arranged into neutrality. "New signal," Priya said. "The choir? Maybe. Different frequency, different origin point." She pulled up the display. About 40 light years out. Started about 2 months ago by our reckoning. It's passive. No encoding, no classification scheme. She looked at Dara. "It's just receiving. Whatever is there, it's just listening." "Listening to us?" listening to us. Dara looked at the display for a long time. Are we still transmitting? She said. We never stopped. Good. She looked at the display a moment longer. Then she picked up the coffee that Priya had put by her elbow and held it in both hands and felt the warmth of it. What are we sending them right now? Priya checked her terminal. Live feeds from 47 camera networks globally. Mostly mundane. A school in Auckland, a street market in Dakar, a construction site in Seoul, a fishing village in... She paused, looking at one of the feeds. Someone's birthday party in Guadalajara. Looks like a kid's party. There's a cake. Dara looked at the birthday party feed. Small humans in paper hats. An enormous cake with the number 7 on it. Someone had tied balloons to the back of a chair, and 2 of them had gotten loose and were against the ceiling. And a small kid was trying to reach them with a broom handle. Not quite making it. Trying again. The particular focus of a 7-year-old who has decided this is the task. Perfect, she said. She watched the kid with the broom handle. Outside the coordination center, beyond the mountain and the altitude and the pale mineral landscape. The planet was going about its business in the way it had been going about its business for the past 2 years, which was slowly, tenderly, stubbornly. The way a thing recovers when it has not been defeated, but has been shaken, when it knows it will be shaken again, and has decided that the shaking does not change what it is. Cities rebuilding their grids, fields being planted, people calling people, letters being written and sent across distances for no strategic reason whatsoever. Above all of it, the sky, full of things that were watching. Below all of it, the stubborn animal fact of being alive, which was the one thing in the universe that kept falling outside the categories of whatever was watching and would keep falling outside them, she suspected, for as long as there were human cameras and the irresistible human need to point the cameras at things that deserved to be kept. The kid on the feed finally got the balloons with the broom handle. The room erupted. Someone cut the cake. Dara watched it for a moment and then went back to work. Whatever was 40 light years out, watching through a signal it had not yet identified as a receiver, was getting all of it. The school in Auckland, and the market in Dakar, and the kid in Guadalajara, reaching for balloons with a broom handle. 40 light years of transmission lag, which meant they were watching humanity, as it had been 40 years ago. Before any of this, before the choir, before the blackout, before the tungsten rods and the gravitational spoof and the letter in the corridor, they were watching humanity in its ordinary state, going about the endless business of being human, which was making things and breaking things, and calling the people you loved, and recording the things you thought were worth recording and singing to the water when you needed to, and reaching for what was just out of range. Good, she thought. Let them watch. Let them try to figure it out. Let them spend their 40 years building models and filing symbols and constructing a census of what humanity was, and when they finally arrived at a conclusion, let them find out that by the time their ships reached this system, the thing they had concluded about was already different, already changed, already doing something new that didn't fit their models, because that was what humans did. She thought, we are the anomaly. We have always been the anomaly. That is the oldest thing about us. The guitar started up again in the common room. It was a different player this time. Faster, something with rhythm. She could hear 2 or 3 people already clapping along. The stars watched. Humanity played on. There was a tradition at the Atacama installation. Informal, self-organized, and never officially sanctioned, that had started sometime during the blackout period and simply never stopped. On clear nights, which in the Atacama was most nights, the sky being what it was, whoever was off shift and willing would walk up to the hilltop above the installation with whatever they had. Coffee, a blanket, sometimes the guitar, sometimes a radio picking up distant stations, sometimes nothing at all. They would sit on the rocks and look at the sky, not monitoring it. The monitoring happened in the building below, just looking, just being there, in the dark, in the cold, with a sky full of things that were watching. The tradition had been going for 2 years. when Dara left the installation for a posting in Geneva, and as far as she knew, it was still going. She thought it would probably keep going for as long as there were people at the installation and a sky above it, which was all it needed. The thing about humans is they do not need a reason to look at the sky. They have never needed a reason. That was in the 11 years of footage too. All those cameras pointed upward for no functional purpose at all, just the unending human impulse to look at the thing above you and wonder about it. Whatever was out there, the choir recalibrating and observing, the new signal 40 light years out, whatever else was pointed at them that they hadn't detected yet, was getting all of it. The pointing upward, the wondering, the absurd, irrational, definitively unadaptive act of sitting on a rock in the cold at night and looking at a sky you cannot reach and feeling something you cannot name. Dara had sat on that hilltop on her last night at the installation. Alone, she had gone up early, before the off-shift walk started. She had a thermos of tea and her notebook and the particular quality of stillness she had developed over 2 years of nights in the Atacama, which was not the absence of thought, but the kind of thinking that doesn't produce output, that exists only for itself. She had thought about what it cost to be unresolvable. Not strategically. She had been thinking about the strategy for 2 years, and she knew it as well as she was going to know it. She had been thinking about the personal cost, the cost of being the thing that fell outside every category, the cost of being anomalous, of the error in the system, of being the species that generated 12 million threat flags, not because it was dangerous, but because it was incomprehensible. She had thought about the woman singing to the ocean. She had never found out who she was. The footage was from a pier camera on the coast of Maine at So 3 Sun 7 on a Tuesday in early October, and the woman was middle-aged and was wearing what looked like a sweatshirt and standing at the very end of the pier, facing the water. She sang for about 4 minutes. The camera caught her face once, when she turned, not in response to anything, just the small movement a body makes when it breathes, and the expression on her face was not performative, not sad, not particularly anything. She was just doing the thing. She was just singing to the water, because something in her needed to. That footage had been in the choir's threat cluster. Specifically, that particular woman on that particular pier, at that particular hour, had been flagged as a threat. Dara had thought about that a lot. She had wondered if the woman knew. She had decided the woman probably didn't know, and also that it wouldn't change anything if she did. The woman would still have gone to the pier. The water would still have been there. The singing would still have wanted to happen. That was the thing. That was the whole thing, really. It wanted to happen. The letter wanted to be written. The music wanted to be made. The photographs wanted to be taken of people mid-law, at specific instants that would never be repeated. It was not survival. It was not strategy. It was the irreducible human need to make marks and send them out and say, this existed. I was here. We were here. This specific thing, on this specific night, in this specific form. She had sat on the hilltop and felt the cold of the Atacama settle into her bones and looked at the sky and thought about all of it, about the weight of being the anomaly, about what it meant that the most threatening thing about humanity, to a civilization advanced enough to cross interstellar distances, was not their weapons or their wars, but their habit of doing things that didn't make sense. She had thought, we were almost erased for singing to the ocean. She had thought, and we will sing to the ocean again tonight, or tomorrow night, or next year. We will keep singing to it. We will keep pointing cameras at things that deserve to be kept. We will keep writing letters and sending them across distances to people who are not here, but whose existence is real and necessary and worth the two-corridor stop. We will keep sitting on hillsides in the cold and looking at things we cannot reach, because something in us needs to. And if something out there finds that anomalous, finds it an error, finds it a threat, then they will keep coming back to look at it. And each time they come back, they will find the same thing, which is still here, still singing, still reaching for the balloons with the broom handle, Not quite there. Trying again. Still happening. Below the hilltop, the installation hummed. The people on shift were watching their displays, maintaining their contacts, sending and receiving, keeping the line open to whatever was out there. The people off shift were beginning to gather at the base of the path that led up to the hilltop, and she could hear the guitar being tuned down there and the quiet voices of people who were tired and had done hard work and were coming up here anyway because the sky was something, and the cold was honest, and the company of people looking at the same dark was its own kind of warmth. She put her notebook away. She poured the last of the tea. The first of them came up the path. 2 of the signal analysts, the ones who had been pulling 30-hour shifts all week. And they settled onto rocks nearby and said nothing, and looked at the sky with her, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. That was the whole thing, compressed into 2 people sitting on rocks in the cold and the dark, being in the same place as other people, and letting the sky be the sky, and not needing it to be anything more than that. The guitar came up the path, then more people, the ones who had finished their shift, and then the ones who had come up just to be here, and gradually the hilltop filled in the quiet way of people who had agreed without. That speaking that this was where they wanted to be. Someone started playing. Something simple and slow. Someone hummed along. The stars did their thing, which was everything, which was the specific arrangement they had been making since before there were human eyes to look at them and would continue making. After the last, human had stopped looking, but were making right now for this specific audience of people on this specific rock who had earned the right to sit under them. Dara looked at the sky. The sky looked back. Far out in it, somewhere beyond what any eye could resolve, things were watching, taking notes, building new categories, trying to understand the species that had turned off its lights and shot kinetic impactors at their ships, and then, in the most crucial moment of the engagement, chosen to transmit a doctor reading a letter in a corridor. She hoped they were having a difficult time with it. She hoped it would take them a long time to arrive at any conclusions. She hoped that by the time they did, humanity would have done 17 more things that didn't fit any of their categories, and they would have to start over. She took a breath of cold Atacama air that tasted of nothing except altitude and distance, which was its own kind of taste. She felt the rock under her. She looked at the sky. She thought about the woman on the pier, singing to the water in the dark at 3 a.m. And she thought, I know why you did that. I know exactly why. And I hope whatever was watching it is still puzzling over it. And I hope it keeps puzzling. And I hope the puzzle never resolves, because the day it resolves is the day we have become something predictable, and predictable is the one thing we cannot afford to be. Be anomalous. Be the error. Be the threat they can't categorize, because you are made of things that refuse to be categorized. Sing to the water. Write the letter. Sit on the hilltop in the cold, and look at the stars even when you know what lives in them. Especially when you know what lives in them. The guitar played on into the Atacama night, going nowhere, addressed to no one, received by everything. The stars watched. Humanity, stubborn and singing and absolutely unresolvable, kept being.